Wisconsin, a critical battleground state.
The battleground state of Wisconsin.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. The Wisconsin Supreme Court is now in session.
So let's talk about Wisconsin.
This is Swing State of the Union, a podcast all about Wisconsin and why it's so important to U.S. politics. I'm Joy Powers.
And I'm Sam Woods. Thank you so much for joining us. In the year since our last episode aired, a lot has happened. It's been a year dominated by politics, exemplified by fights for control over every facet of our government. As the second Trump administration tries to assert power over a growing list of government agencies, there have been few obstacles in the way. That is, aside from the courts.
The courts have played a central role in stopping or legitimizing Trump's policies. Because of this, they're increasingly seen in a partisan light, raising questions about who they serve and how they rule. Last season on Swing State of the Union, we explored the Wisconsin Supreme Court, examining how partisan politics, money, and judicial ethics have shaped it over the last 30 years.
Now, another Supreme Court election is ahead for Wisconsin voters. So, we've returned for 2 bonus episodes. We'll investigate a couple broad questions about our state courts, like how do we hold justices accountable, and how do different justices interpret Wisconsin's Constitution? And we'll hear from the candidates about their judicial philosophies and what's at stake in this election. But before we get into these big questions, let's look at what happened since last April's election and what we learned last season.
When we last left off, the eyes of the nation were once again on Wisconsin. It was the most expensive state court race in history, drawing contributions from big money donors like Elon Musk. Voters elected liberal-backed Justice Susan Crawford as the state's next Supreme Court justice over conservative-backed Judge Brad Schimmel. In November, Schimmel was appointed interim U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin by the Trump administration. Trump had endorsed Schimmel in the Supreme Court race.
This spring, Wisconsin will once again elect a new Supreme Court justice, as conservative-leaning Rebecca Bradley is stepping down after 11 years on the bench. Liberal-leaning justices will still be in the majority regardless of this election's outcome, but a win would increase that majority. So what did we learn last season? The state Supreme Court sits at the top of all Wisconsin courts. It doesn't generally handle things like speeding tickets or criminal trials, which are handled by Wisconsin's lower courts. Cases at the Supreme Court deal with questions about how to interpret Wisconsin's Constitution, or with how the state administers its courts.
Miriam Seifter, co-director of the State Democracy Research Initiative, says ads for Supreme Court candidates are often misleading about what the court actually does.
For example, advertisements might seek to portray a candidate as tough on crime or an opponent as soft on crime. But in the overwhelming majority of cases, a state Supreme Court justice is not determining what a criminal sentence should be.
Instead, the majority of cases are on civil matters, and most aren't the headline-making cases we might associate with the state Supreme Court.
And these are often cases about what a provision of a Wisconsin statute means. A handful of those civil cases will be on hot-button issues like abortion or redistricting. But actually, the court's day-to-day is much lower-profile matters, although, of course, they're matters that are very important to people throughout the state.
But judicial candidates are running political campaigns, and these days they need to signify their partisan alignment to voters.
In this election, each candidate represents a different end of the political spectrum. Though they are careful not to say exactly how they'd rule on cases related to hot-button issues like abortion rights or redistricting, each candidate has drawn support from our 2 main political parties. As Philip Rocco, Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, explains, this is why these campaigns continue to be a battleground for partisan politics.
They are, in name, nonpartisan elections. But in reality, parties themselves and mega donors associated with political parties have in recent years contributed tens of millions of dollars to candidates sort of on both sides of the ideological spectrum.
Over the last year, the liberal-leaning court has made headlines with a few big cases. It overturned Wisconsin's 1849 abortion ban. It sided with Governor Evers in a case on his use of the partial veto power, which extended an increase in education funding for 400 years. It also reduced the power of state legislative committees.
But deep ideological divides between justices have continued to plague the court, and that may be impacting the cases they take. According to the State Democracy Research Initiative, last year the court only issued opinions in 23 cases, far fewer than its recent average of 50 cases. Marquette Law School professor Chad Oldfather says the kinds of cases they're hearing are also different.
It has been, I think, attentive to taking more sort of bread and butter type cases, right? Things that involve difficult legal questions that are interesting and important to the people who work in those areas and obviously to the parties themselves, but that don't tend to attract a great deal of public attention.
Like partisan elections for governor or president, money plays a huge role. During last year's Supreme Court election, Wisconsin set the record for spending in a state court race, tallying around $144 million, according to Wisconsin Watch. This was nearly triple the previous record for spending in a state court race, set in 2023 by Wisconsin.
As Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel watchdog columnist Dan Bice explained last season, much of this money came as a result of the national attention on the race.
The text message I just got from the Musk campaign, the text message said, "This is Elon Musk's America PAC, and we think it's important to protect Donald Trump's agenda. Call this number and we'll tell you how." You call the number and they tell you to vote for Brad Schemmel.
But with all the partisan money pouring into these races, what happens once a candidate is on the bench? As Jay Heck, former director of Common Cause Wisconsin, told us previously, justices are still allowed to rule on cases involving their donors.
Anybody who looks at a campaign of a justice for the Supreme Court and sees that they've received an enormous amount of money from a group, and that group then somehow finds its way, whether it's WMC or some Democratic Party group, and they come before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and the justice decides for themselves, well, no, I can be fair and unbiased, and I can listen to this case. Well, I don't think a lot of people believe that.
So to recap, the Wisconsin Supreme Court handles cases related to the Wisconsin Constitution, not things like traffic tickets. Justices are officially nonpartisan, but because the court settles cases on issues like abortion rights and redistricting, political parties and their donors are often involved. Once justices win election and are on the bench, it's up to them to decide whether they can be impartial on cases related to their donors' interests. After a short break, we'll dig into how we hold Wisconsin judges accountable and what accountability looks like in the Trump era.
If you're enjoying Swing State of the Union, please share it with a friend and drop a rating wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoy conversations about Wisconsin politics, check out Capitol Notes, a podcast from WUWM hosted by reporter Mayan Silver. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts or on WUWM's flagship program, Lake Effect.
Partisanship and money continue to be dominant factors in this year's election. But there are other, more philosophical questions about our courts. This episode will dive into the question of accountability. In Wisconsin, once we elect a justice to the Supreme Court, they're there for 10 years. So how do we hold them accountable to do what they said on the campaign trail? And what mechanisms are in place to ensure they act ethically? What happens when our concepts of judicial ethics collide with partisan politics?
There are two high-profile examples of this question playing out in Wisconsin. First, we'll examine the investigation into former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Michael Gableman. Then, we'll delve into last year's arrest and conviction of Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan. But we'll start by looking at who investigates when judges and lawyers are accused of wrongdoing. Wisconsin has two offices that handle complaints for lawyers and judges. For judges, that office is the Wisconsin Judicial Commission. Founded in 1972, the commission has the power to investigate and discipline all judges in Wisconsin, from Supreme Court to municipal court. Chad Oldfather, professor of law at Marquette Law School, explains the types of complaints the commission investigates.
These are for more process-related concerns, right? And so the Code of Judicial Conduct requires judges to, uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary, to avoid impropriety, avoid maybe more importantly or as importantly the appearance of impropriety, to be impartial. They're to avoid conflicts of interest, and they're, of course, to avoid overt political partisanship.
Anyone, not just judges and lawyers, can file a complaint with the Judicial Commission. Once that complaint is filed, it's the commission's job to look into it and, if necessary, investigate and discipline the judge in question. But most complaints don't trigger further investigation. Of the more than 650 complaints filed in 2024, only 36 investigations took place, and even fewer investigations lead to discipline.
About 2/3 of those end up getting dismissed after some preliminary investigation. The remainder go to full investigation. About half of those lead to nothing, and the remainder involve some amount of whether it's called an expression of concern. Sometimes it's called a warning, and they're very careful not to label it a reprimand, but we might informally at least think of it as that. Occasionally, the more serious cases will go to the state Supreme Court, which can consider more substantial discipline.
When the Judicial Commission looks into these cases, they are looking for evidence that the judge violated Wisconsin's Code of Ethics. But violations of the code are rarely cut and dry because the Code of Ethics itself is rather broad. As Oldfather mentioned, tenets of Wisconsin's judicial code include things like a judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. But what do concepts like impropriety look like in practice? It can be hard to tell.
There are sort of nested levels of specificity which never quite get down to here's the bright line that governs particular situations because, of course, there's an infinite number of possible situations that can arise and you can't possibly anticipate all of them and regulate them all in advance. So the best you can do is draw inferences from these general propositions and then look at past situations involving judges who've been disciplined and ask, what did they do? What are the implications of that decision for this situation, which is pretty typical legal reasoning.
Of the over 650 complaints filed in 2024, only 5 resulted in formal warnings, and only 1 complaint was filed with the state Supreme Court. But are there other ways to remove a judge or lawyer other than a formal investigation if they're accused of misconduct or even a crime?
John Gross, clinical professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School, explains that yes, judges can be removed for criminal convictions or face impeachment.
Judges can be charged with crimes, face criminal penalties, and then again, if they're convicted of criminal penalties, you would expect discipline or removal as well as a sanction for them. And then also there are some ways for the legislature to get involved. There are different mechanisms, including impeachment, that would potentially trigger removal of a judge if the legislature decided to initiate those proceedings.
Both of these are rare. Only one judge has ever been impeached in Wisconsin history, Judge Levi Hubble, in 1853, on charges that included taking a $200 bribe. But you may be more familiar with a Milwaukee County judge who was convicted of a crime and faced threats of impeachment last year.
Good evening. We are interrupting regular programming with breaking news in the trial of Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan.
And that verdict coming in just moments ago, it is a split verdict.
We'll return to Judge Dugan's criminal case later in this episode.
However, first, let's look into a case of judicial discipline that involves the oversight boards for judges and lawyers. The person at the center of it, former Supreme Court Justice Michael Gableman. He could temporarily lose his law license following an investigation into misconduct. You may remember Gableman from our last season. He was elected to the court in 2008 with the financial backing of Wisconsin Manufacturers in Commerce. In 2018, he left the court and went to work for the Trump administration, and his relationship with President Trump would ultimately lead to the current controversy around him.
The case against former Justice Michael Gableman is lengthy. The story starts in 2021. After losing re-election in 2020, then former President Donald Trump demanded an investigation into Wisconsin's results. The election had already been certified, and auditors found no evidence of widespread voter fraud. But under pressure from the former president, Republican Assembly Speaker Robin Vos hired Gableman to lead a new investigation into the election. Here's law professor John Gross.
This wasn't an instance where someone had filed a complaint about election interference or there was legitimate evidence of election interference, and then there was a response to that in terms of doing an investigation. No, this was clearly a politically initiated investigation where there was really no evidence at the start and a mandate to go try to find some evidence of this.
After Gableman was hired to lead the newly created Office of Special Counsel, he began demanding extensive records from the state's election officials. And he issued subpoenas to other public officials, despite it being unclear if he had the power to do so.
The entire process was plagued by errors, from simple typos in official orders to misrepresenting his actions to clients and the public. Then came the lawsuits and the countersuits, back and forth as Gableman tried to assert more power over the investigation, despite waning support from his political allies. Gableman's investigation into the election was cut short in 2022 when Assembly Speaker Vos fired him.
Shambolic would be a generous word. It was a complete mess and really a clown show. It was not conducted in accord with binding principles of Wisconsin law, and it was not conducted in accord with the ethical obligations that apply to and govern all lawyers in Wisconsin.
That's Jeff Mandel, president and general counsel of Law Forward. It's the group that filed the initial ethics complaint against Gableman. That complaint prompted an investigation by the Office of Lawyer Regulation, or OLR. OLR is similar to the Wisconsin Judicial Commission, only it investigates lawyers accused of misconduct rather than judges. But the process still requires someone to file a complaint, which is then investigated by OLR.
In 2025, the investigation found that Gableman committed 10 lawyer misconduct violations during his time working for the state. The former justice violated open records laws, insulted opposing counsel, and even tried to have the mayors of Madison and Green Bay imprisoned for defying his petition. And perhaps more egregiously, Gross says that Gableman used the courts to abuse his legal opponents.
And you're not supposed to file a lawsuit that is baseless, right? Either baseless in fact or baseless in law. And if you do that, that's a form of harassment. You're just making somebody come to court, hire a lawyer, answer this complaint, not because you have any chance of winning your legal case. It's just meant to harass, annoy, and cost them money.
Wisconsin lawyers take an oath when they become a member of the bar to do things like uphold the state and federal constitutions, respect court officers, and abstain from, quote, all offensive personality. Here's Mandel.
When you get to be a lawyer in Wisconsin, you swear an oath to become a member of the bar. And the oath in Wisconsin is quite long. And one of the ethics rules is that you will fulfill your oath, such that violating that oath is its own ethical obligation, separate and apart from whatever other ethics rules you might have violated. And at the end of our grievance to OLR, we showed Michael Gableman had, in his time as special counsel, violated every single clause in the entire oath.
After the investigation into Gableman's behavior concluded, OLR decided on a 3-year suspension of his law license, a penalty that Mandel claims is much less than it should be, given the extent of the misconduct.
Still, Gableman is contesting the penalty, but who will have the final say? His former workplace, the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
And so you really see just a lawyer who appears to be unmoored to the ethical constraints that should guide his behavior. And you rarely see that. It is even more unlikely that you would see that in someone who has sat on the Supreme Court.
It's not just surprising that a former Supreme Court justice would behave this way. It also complicates how they're held accountable for that behavior. Like how justices can decide to sit on cases involving their campaign donors, justices can also decide to recuse themselves from the Gableman case, or not. Here's Marquette law professor Chad Oldfather.
It's the judges themselves who are charged with responsibility for answering the question, can I be impartial in this case? And what they're supposed to do if they conclude that they can't, or if it would appear as though they cannot be impartial, is they're to recuse themselves and someone else take their place in presiding over a particular situation.
Already, Supreme Court Justice Susan Crawford has recused herself from the case, because in her previous job, she worked in close proximity with the judge who heard a lawsuit involving Gableman. Gableman's legal team has also tried to get 2 other liberal-leaning justices to recuse, but they have declined. The situation could bring the case to federal court if Gableman's team is able to argue that his federal constitutional rights have been infringed. Gableman's legal team did not provide a response by deadline to a request for comment about his case.
Gableman's case is one example of how judges and lawyers can be held accountable when they're accused of wrongdoing. Now, let's get into a more high-profile case that you've probably heard of.
The latest move in President Trump's immigration crackdown saw the FBI arresting a Wisconsin judge. Federal authorities say the judge helped a man sneak out of her courtroom.
Last April, Eduardo Flores Ruiz appeared in Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan's courtroom for a misdemeanor battery charge. Flores Ruiz was an undocumented immigrant who had lived and worked in Milwaukee for over a decade. Federal immigration agents came to the courthouse to arrest him. Instead, Dugan distracted the agents while letting Flores Ruiz out of a back door, though agents later arrested Flores Ruiz. A week later, the Federal Department of Justice charged Dugan with knowingly concealing Flores Ruiz from the agents and obstructing agents' efforts to detain him. For Gross, these charges were unusual for a sitting judge.
I mean, the first thing is that it is just extremely rare to see the Department of Justice file criminal charges against a state judge. That in itself is a very rare occurrence. When it does occur, it normally relates to some type of corrupt practice that the judge was engaged in, something like bribery. And so a charge related to the judge obstructing federal agents or obstructing the arrest of an individual by federal agents in a state courthouse, it's virtually unprecedented to file a charge like this.
The optics of the arrest were also unusual. Immediately after Judge Dugan's arrest, FBI Director Kash Patel shared a photo of her so-called perp walk with the caption, "No one is above the law." The arrest came 3 months after Trump took office, promising mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. Making an example of Dugan represented an opportunity to show he was serious about that promise.
This is not a prosecution that was started because there was a real concern about needing to address what Judge Dugan did. It was a prosecution that was initiated to send a message to all state judges, which is that any refusal to coordinate and facilitate the arrests of individuals in a state courthouse by federal immigration agents, that will result in a federal felony.
That analysis is not hindsight. The day Dugan was arrested, Trump officials like Attorney General Pam Bondi told Fox News that the arrest was meant to send a message to those resisting President Trump's agenda of mass deportations.
Some of these judges think they are beyond and above the law, and they are not. And we're sending a very strong message today. If you are harboring a fugitive, we don't care who you are. If you are helping hide one, if you are giving a TDA member guns, anyone who is illegally in this country, we will come after you and we will prosecute you.
Even local politicians, like Republican State Representative Bob Donovan, saw Dugan's arrest as sending a larger message. Here he is on Milwaukee's Fox 6.
Most citizens expect criminals to be handled as criminals and to be arrested for their crimes and to face the consequences of their actions. How that's done, sometimes it's not pretty, but it's got to be done. And, a strong message, I think, needs to be sent.
Dugan's legal team did not provide a response by deadline to our requests for comment about her case. After the arrest, protesters in Milwaukee supported Dugan's alleged actions.
When I start showing up in our courtrooms, that is not standing for accountability. That's not the rule of law. That's the rule of dictators. That is not justice, that's intimidation, and we refuse to be silent.
The case went to trial in Milwaukee. In a split decision, Dugan was found guilty of the more serious charge of obstructing federal agents, but not guilty of concealing Flores Ruiz. Dugan is now seeking to overturn that decision and has since resigned. Weeks before Dugan was arrested, Brad Schimmel had just lost his bid to become a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice. The Trump administration later appointed him to interim U.S. Attorney for eastern Wisconsin. After Dugan's conviction, he claimed Dugan's case was not about politics.
We weren't trying to make an example out of anyone. This was necessary to hold Judge Dugan accountable in our assessment because of the actions she took. That's what we did. There isn't from our perspective in this office, there's not a political aspect to it.
Both Judge Dugan and former Justice Gableman seem to represent the ideological divides in our culture and our politics. As Professor Chad Oldfather explains, these cases are both unusual.
I think what makes them unique is that they involve, in one case, a sitting judge, in another case, a former justice on the state Supreme Court, acting in ways that the public looks at and assesses as being clearly partisan in nature.
But these two cases are also very different. Gross explains.
Both sides of the political spectrum can look at these cases and allege that there's a political element to both of them. But honestly, from my perspective, I think the potential abuse of prosecutorial discretion in bringing the charges that they did bring against Judge Dugan suggests some amount of politics, right? But again, I think Gableman's situation is one where he's being investigated by a nonpartisan office of lawyer regulation, right? And so I think their findings about his misconduct, it's much harder. I don't think you can really argue that office has a political motivation, because that is a nonpartisan office as opposed to the DOJ that is controlled by the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who is appointed by the president.
The case against former Justice Gableman involves overwhelming evidence of misconduct over months of his work as special counsel for the state of Wisconsin. The case against former Judge Dugan is about how you interpret a single event and the intersection of state and federal law. For Mandel, these cases don't bear much resemblance. Remember, Mandel leads the group that filed the complaint against Gableman.
I don't think they're comparable. I mean, I think that they both fit in different ways into a broad conversation about judicial accountability. But I think that with Mr. Gableman, what you see is repeated, flagrant violations of known, clear rules and a real disregard for basic ethical conduct as a lawyer. I think that with Judge Dugan, things are more complicated because we have not seen cases like this before. And this is a highly contested situation where people feel strongly on both sides of how did Judge Dugan's conduct line up with state law and with federal law and with ethics.
Yet each of these cases sends a message about how politics are meant to stay out of the courtroom, whether we agree with them or not.
Odds are you are not an investigator for OLR or the Wisconsin Judicial Commission. Odds are you were not a jury member on Judge Dugan's trial. And odds are you are not a Supreme Court justice reviewing Michael Gableman's pending punishment.
But come April 7th, every Wisconsin voter will have the opportunity to hold potential justices accountable at the ballot box.
Elections themselves are one of the sources of discipline on judicial ethics, right? That ideally, part of what we, the people, are considering when we decide how to cast our votes for judicial candidates is, do I think this person will fulfill the ethical obligations of the office?
Remember, these judges will be on the bench for a decade. Early voting starts March 24th.
On the next episode of Swing State of the Union, we hear from the candidates themselves and explore different approaches to judicial interpretation.
Are they familiar with the state's constitution? Do they recognize that it has these kinds of differences we've been discussing that make it different from the U.S. Constitution, which means that when they interpret it, they shouldn't just reflexively parrot what the U.S. Supreme Court has said because the Constitution they're dealing with might be quite different.
Interpreting the Interpreters. Next time on Swing State of the Union. I'm Sam Woods.
And I'm Joy Powers. Swing State of the Union is produced by WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, a part of the NPR network. Please subscribe to the Swing State of the Union podcast, wherever you like to listen.